and welcome for all of you who are tuned in. You're watching TMH as we present you our daily English news. Our headlines for today: member of the UK Parliament says Tigray is Africa's Ukraine. Scholar says Eritrea's Isaias Afwerki has been exercising a veto over any possibility of resolving this ongoing conflict and war on Tigray. And former U.S. ambassador to Asmara describes the Eritrean regime as inherently toxic. As we move on to our main updates, member of the UK Parliament says Tigray is currently Africa's Ukraine. David Alton, who's UK's Liberal Democratic Member of Parliament, today called for those responsible of bombing civilian population in Tigray and weaponizing rape and starvation to finally be brought to justice. He also renewed his call for the withdrawal of Eritrean forces from the entire region of Tigray. Let's take a listen.
Parliamentary Group on Eritrea. Would the Noble Lord agree that the malign role of Eritrean militias has undoubtedly exacerbated an already grievous situation, that the conflict is spreading from Tigray to other ethnic groups and to neighbouring countries, with terrorist organisations such as Al-Shabaab exploiting the instability? My Lords, with an entire population, as the Noble Lord the Minister has said, on the verge of starvation and death, how has the United Kingdom responded to the bombing of civilian targets, including in close proximity recently to the university in Mekelle, and in galvanising the international community to end the weaponising of hunger and famine, rapes and gender-based violence, and to bring those responsible to justice? Does he not agree that the scale of what is happening in Africa is directly comparable to the scale of what is happening in Europe, in Ukraine?
Responding to this, Minister for Pacific and the Environment at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, Lord Goldsmith, said the spectacular economic development that Ethiopia saw in the last decades are massively at risk today.
Millions of people in Ethiopia have, in recent years, been lifted out of poverty. I mean, it was a development success story. We all remember the horrors that really created much of what we now regard to be the aid movement. But those gains that we saw are massively at risk today. And the reality is that millions upon millions of people are now facing a return to base poverty, actual starvation. So this is, of course, a priority for us. And we are working with all of the international bodies that have a role to play, whether that's in preventing sexual violence, whether it's alleviating the immediate threats of starvation. We're working through all the UN agencies. We are and remain an international development leader in Africa, notwithstanding the pressures on the ODA budget in the UK, and Africa will remain a priority for us.
As Eritrea's involvement continues in this ongoing conflict between the Ethiopian government and the Tigrayan forces, former U.S. ambassador to Asmara describes the Eritrean regime as inherently toxic. In an article published on The Atlantic under the title "Totalitarianism is Still With Us," Steve Walker, who's former chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Asmara, Eritrea, said the case of Eritrea shows the totalitarian system are inherently toxic and that no amount of engagement will change them. According to the writer, Eritrea's no vote to UN General Assembly resolution in March condemning Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine was the only one that was surprised. He expressed his dismay at Eritrea's rebuff to established norms of international behavior, in the process incurring irreversible reputational damage while seemingly gaining nothing. The writer also noted that Eritrea is a human rights house of horrors. Dissent is illegal, there's no independent press. Under compulsory, indefinite, and national services, citizens are conscripted and assigned to civilian jobs. The country has never held a national election. Eritreans live in a state of perpetual fear. The secret police and informers proliferate, arrests are arbitrary, citizens are routinely detained but not told on to what charge, and the lucky ones who are lucky to be released are given no reason for their freedom and are just told to remain silent. He said Eritrea does not exist when Jean Kirkpatrick, a former diplomat and a political scientist who wrote her classic Dictatorships and Double Standards, but the pariah state that today haunts the Horn of Africa confirms her essay's contention that the totalitarian system are more pernicious than authoritarian. and the ideology constructed in ways that precludes liberation and inevitably destabilizing the entire Horn. For his experience in Eritrea, the diplomat gleaned the following lessons. The diplomat engaged with totalitarian states and feudal that our regimes aren't satisfied with political control and that their demand are pervasive control that can only come by determining the truth. He also noted that the confrontation is necessary and appropriate and that the totalitarian states are inherently destabilizing and should be isolated and contained. Eritrea's information minister, Al Orling Orwell, described his no vote to the UN resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a demonstration of Eritrea's uncompromising stand for peace. But according to the U.S. diplomat, Eritrea's bizarre actions aimed at punishing the U.S. for American sanctions imposed on Eritrea last fall, when diplomatic engagement failed to persuade the regime to withdraw its forces from the northern region of Ethiopia. The diplomat said that this came at the expense of fundamental international principles and contradicted Eritrea's previous public positions and confirmed Eritrea's pariah status and appears to not have mattered to the Eritrean leaderships at all. He also added that it is another aspect of totalitarianism and regimes that are led or by mercurial paranoid, and our grievance of success in the engaging with people should be modest. He argued the assumptions that underpin traditional notions of diplomacy as the collegial resolution of competing interests do not apply to the totalitarian states. My time in Eritrea taught me that the confrontation and not the compromise is the best approach when dealing with these kinds of regimes. As we move on to our final update for today, Algeria-Ethiopia reapproachment threatens the Arab summit that's going to take place in Algeria. The Tebboune government's stance on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam also accentuates the Egyptian-Algerian crisis. The current reapproachment between Algeria and Ethiopia, as highlighted by the recent visit of the Ethiopian Prime Minister to the North African country, is jeopardizing the holding of the next Arab League summit in Algiers, scheduled for early November. As two Egyptian diplomats have revealed to an Al-Arabi and Al-Jadid, there is a consensus between Egyptians and a senior Gulf official on the difficulty of holding the Arab League meeting in the light of the current Arab and regional crisis. According to sources, certain aspects of Algeria's foreign policy have triggered reticence on the part of the Gulf and officials have holding the upcoming Arab summit. These include Algeria's relations with Iran, its lack of support for the Arab nations, visas in Tehran, and it desires to rejoin the Syrian and the Arab League and its confrontation with Morocco, among others. On the other hand, Egyptian diplomats underline Algeria's insistence on expanding relations with Ethiopia and opening new horizons without taking into account the crisis between Cairo and Addis Ababa currently. Recent moves by Algeria have aroused some mistrust in Egypt, which has been engaged in decade-long diplomatic dispute with Ethiopia over this Nile water resources. And in this dispute, Cairo receives significant support from numbers of countries, including Morocco, which in May announced its support for Egypt's water security, calling it an integral part of the Arab water security total. According to the Moroccan media outlet, Rabat also called for the abandoning unilateral policies in relations to the international rivers and respecting the international law, directly alluding to Ethiopian practices related to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Algeria, on the other hand, has recognized Ethiopia's full rights to develop its natural resources and as well its willingness to share experiences in the protection of water resources, and Algeria's since stance on the GRD crisis prompted Al-Sisi to opt out of the summit, as well as the creation of the Group of the Four Nations, also known as G4, which includes Algeria, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and South Africa. That concludes our news for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back for some more tomorrow. Bye-bye.